when I was coming down here, and I was told that was not going to fly. So the lovely K-State people took me to Aggieville and took me to Rally House. And so now I have a wonderful K-State Dad t-shirt. It's great. And so for my sermon, I'm gonna take us back a little while ago to April 12th, 1963. That was a date in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. He had been in Birmingham doing his ministry, doing his prophetic mission. He had been organizing and teaching and leading demonstrations and teaching about direct action. And as it normally did, it led him to be in a prison. So he was in prison sitting, and one of his allies snuck him in a paper. And in that paper, he found an open letter from 8 of the prominent clergy of Birmingham in the state of Alabama, one of them being Bishop Carpenter, the Episcopal Bishop of Alabama. And these clergy people, Christians and Jewish, all moral leaders and civic leaders, people who had their thumb kind of on the moral compass of the city and the state, had released a letter saying that there needs to be a call for unity, that the protesting, the agitating, the direct action needed to cease, that it was disrupting our economy, it was disrupting our daily life, it was interrupting what it means to be a part of a community, that the outside agitators, being Dr. King, needed to leave, that they were causing more trouble, they might incite violence. For some context, like Father Patrick said, I'm from Alabama. Both my parents are from Birmingham, Alabama. My father has a distinct memory of when he was 6 years old in 1963, having to go stay with his aunt for about a month because there was such a fear that something would happen, a riot. Birmingham was known as Bombingham, that there had been a church bombing, there was domestic terrorism, there's all kinds of awful stuff. So you would expect your ministers to release a letter, a call for unity. That was the reasonable thing to do. That was the decent thing to do. That was the polite thing to do, was to call for unity, to say that it's time to wait. The courts will sort it out. The courts will figure it out. We don't need to demonstrate. We don't need to cause trouble. But when King read that open letter, he reflected and said that his dreams were shattered. He had had a hope when he came to Alabama that the religious leaders would have seen his prophetic message, would have seen their black brothers and sisters standing up and calling for justice and would have joined them. But they called for law and order. They called for decency. They called for order. This was a reasonable response. And King was seen as an extremist. And he wrote a letter back to these clergy people, which became the letter from the Birmingham jail, which is now an iconic piece of history from the civil rights period. And in that letter, he quotes today's scripture. He quotes the gospel for today in saying, "You call me an extremist, but was not Jesus an extremist for love? Was not Jesus an extremist?" What Dr. King was saying was that these men, these clergy people, were not stating what they were serving was moderation. They were serving politeness. They were serving order. But they weren't serving Jesus. Because Jesus isn't reasonable. Jesus is radical. Jesus is transforming. These people are saying that what they believe in is moderation in the middle. And that's something often we lift up. We say it's good to be in the middle. It's good to be on both sides of it. It's good to see that. It's good to be above the fray. That's something that we think is magnanimous. But not having a side is having a side. Jesus has a point of view. God has a point of view. If you want to follow Jesus, follow him to the margins. That's where he is. Following Jesus is a radical act. Often, Christianity can be sanitized. We can reduce it to the wonderful communities have, and they are wonderful. They're life-giving, they're affirming, but that's not all Christianity is. Christianity is a radical way to live your life. It's all-consuming, it's transforming. It calls you to step out of the status quo and step into the margins. It's dangerous, it's uncomfortable, it's not polite, it's radical. But what you have to understand, and what I have to tell myself sometimes, is something that a wise person once told me, Father Patrick. He once told me, you have to be pastoral before you can be prophetic. And that's what the gospel is talking about today. To change someone, there has to be a relationship there. There has to be love. There has to be a connection. If you go up to a stranger and you tell them what to do, they'll just be like, man, that was a rude stranger. I don't want to listen to them. But if your friend, your brother, your neighbor, someone you love and care for, speaks to you and tells you this is wrong, you need to change, we need to do more, that is going to have more of an impact. So loving your enemies, loving the people who don't lend back to you, a part of it is trust, a part of it is a radical way to live your life. Part of it is changing your enemy from the enemy to your brother or your sister or your friend. Love, the way that we are called to live into, is a one that gives space for hope, it gives space for change, it gives space for forgiveness. Dr. King had a dream that we would see a better world. C.S. Lewis once said, to love someone is to see them as God sees them. And our challenge is to imagine the world that God dreams for us, to bring that into reality. Our challenge is to see the world and see our fellow brothers and sisters as God sees them. Because of my relationship with Dylan, and also the campus ministry at K-State, I've heard about some of the wonderful ministries at St. Paul's. You have Happy Kitchen, you have the Encore Shop, which is not a pawn shop, it's a thrift store, as I found out. Two different things. But you are doing a wonderful job. God calls us to love and be specific in our own context, to build relationships, transform our neighborhood, transform the world around us, and you are doing an amazing job. I just call you to dream bigger, dream more, see God, see the world as God sees the world, see our fellow neighbors as the way God sees them. And I think it's our job to pray for each other, because this is radical. This is not a reasonable way to live your life. This is totally unreasonable. If I asked you to love your enemy and pray for the person who hates you and give money when you didn't expect it back, that's not reasonable. That shouldn't be expected. But it's the way of Christianity. It's the way of God. So if you pray for me, I'll pray for you. And hopefully I'll see you on the margins. Amen.